Well, hello there. Debbie here. I wanted to do this video not only as an educational tool, but also as the greatest grief that I have experienced, worse than the loss of a pet, worse than the loss of a parent. It was not related to death, but it was related to loss and betrayal and disappointments. In recovery, we are faced with life, and life without crutches for the most part. When alcohol or drugs or sex or whatever it was had become our crutch, and that has been taken away from us, then we're facing life on life's terms. And that can be extremely devastating. And it can be emotionally so burdensome. And when we confront these issues in our life, these real life issues, then it either strengthens our recovery or we relapse. So I think that relationships are probably one of the most difficult things to attack in recovery. The problem is that we're not used to having healthy relationships. And so we really don't know how to navigate a good relationship, and sometimes we'll settle for any relationship versus being alone. And loneliness is a huge factor in recovery for many people. So I'm doing this video not just as an expression of an experience that occurred for me, but a warning for those who may be involved in a similar experience. I've observed recently that there are several programs online and TV that have become entertainment, and they deal with people in relationships with inmates. I don't want to be discouraging to people who are in those kinds of relationships. I confess I've seen some very successful relationships between people and inmates. They're long and they're difficult, they're expensive, and some of them are successful. But the ones that I want to pay attention to my story are the ones who will end up with the kind of disappointment and betrayal that I experienced. Because if anything was going to take me out of recovery, it was this experience of loss. The reason I have withheld this story for a while is because there's a lot of judgment and criticism and speculation that surrounds it. I'm not ashamed of what I did. As a matter of fact, I take a great deal of pride in the fact that I endured this 5-year relationship. It was exhaustive. It was expensive. It had amazing ups and it had unbelievable lows. But I survived it, and I stayed sober. And I think that is the most important thing I can take from this experience, that I didn't wither away and I didn't relapse. I survived and I thrived in spite of it. So I'm going to get into the meat of the experience, and it's a little bit, maybe boring for some, but it was my experience. In 2001, I was working for juvenile probation in Shasta County, California, and I was going to school. And so I took a short break from my studies and I was watching the Discovery Channel, and a program called Supermax was being featured on the program that night. I was really intrigued because I was working in what was called the Restorative Justice Program at that time. And it was similar to a Scared Straight program where young kids were confronted with a punishment that was determined by the community instead of by the court system. And essentially, when the kids committed a crime, they would go before a board of their immediate community members instead of going before judges and getting a record. So many of the kids were already involved with drugs and alcohol and were committing minor crimes. And these were young kids. My youngest child was 6 years old. And of course, at 17, then they aged out. So I'm watching this program, and this episode was filmed in Oklahoma State Penitentiary. And the man featured who was speaking was an inmate, and he made the statement, "I have not been a drug addict for over 20 years. At that time, he'd already served 25 years of a 100-year sentence. And I thought to myself, as a recovering person, wow, that's a pretty excessive sentence. But I understand what he said when he said that he had not been a drug addict for 20 years. Well, we know that there's all kinds of contraband that you can get in prison, but I was convinced that he was being honest about his not having used while he was in prison or had gotten sober shortly after entering prison. So here I am. I'm 9 years sober at that time. Actually, today I want you to know I'm 33 years sober. But at that time, I was 9 years sober, and I was a Christian, and I believed in what 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, that therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away, and behold, all things are become new. So his statement sparked my curiosity, and I did find out later on that he claimed to be a Christian. So what I found out about this man's case was that he had committed a crime of armed robbery at a pharmacy when he was an adolescent, and he was a heroin addict. And he was 17 at the time when he committed the crime. And so he was tried as an adult, and he was given this sentence of 100 years actually in one day. So because the courts were tired of seeing him because he was a juvenile offender with multiple violations, they gave him this really excessive sentence. However, being a recovering drug addict, it made sense to me to go straight to the pharmacy instead of going through a middleman, the guy on the street selling the dope. And so I wanted him to participate in my program. And I wanted my kids to kind of experience what this man was experiencing, because they were in jeopardy. My kids were in jeopardy. And they could as just easily been sentenced to a long prison term as this man was. And so I reached out to him and I asked him, would he please participate in my program? Well, he refused. He felt that as a result of his exposure on that show, that he was going to be exploited by all kinds of different agencies. Well, that was just a ploy, I found out later on, because following my first letter that I wrote to him, which was a professional letter encouraging him to be in the program, I followed that letter with one that was more personal. And I talked about, in recovery, we have to give back. And I hoped that he would take that to heart and then he would give back by participating in my program. Well, the disclosures that I made in my personal letters turned out to be a huge mistake because I gave him a lot more personal information than I should have. And eventually this information was used against me. The word con comes from the root word of convince. And through our conversations and our correspondence, I became convinced that he was transformed. I do believe that his contribution helped my kids, but personally, I know today I was conned. However, going on with my story, when the project ended, he invited me to come out and meet him and his family. So I did go out to Oklahoma and meet him. And I found him to be extremely attractive, very articulate, intelligent, and he was a published author as well. So it was impressive. While I was there, I stayed with his father, and his family was very impressive. His father was retired military and at 75 had become a private investigator. His brother-in-law was a highway patrolman. His sister was a dispatcher for highway patrol. And his other brother-in-law was a homicide detective for Oklahoma City. So he came from a good family of law-abiding citizens. And that reinforced in my mind that regardless of the way you've been raised, if you get involved in drugs or alcohol, it's going to destroy any good that was given to you, or any, you were raised in a good environment. It's going to destroy anything that was good in your life. So at that point, I became emotionally involved with this man, and I thought he was genuine and sincere. And he asked me to marry him upon that visit. Well, I was already so deep in the weeds of affection for him that I agreed to marry him. I want to say at this point, though, I never did marry him. But my hope was that one day I would. And there was a dream that developed out of this relationship and out of his correspondence with me and out of my own fantasy. And so when I stepped over the line of just being a friend to being his fiance, the whole dynamics changed. And I was prepared to stay by him for a lifetime, regardless of whether he was in or out of prison. But I was also determined to get him out of prison. So kind of stepping back a little bit, because, my father was not real happy about my decision to become involved with this man. And I'll never forget my dad saying, "Debbie, he wasn't in prison for singing too loud in choir." Well, I could not be convinced that this was not a good man and that he just made some mistakes. I made my own mistakes. I had never been involved with prisons or inmates prior to this, and so I accepted this man at face value and had already fallen in love with him. Once the relationship became personal, I was committed and was determined to get him out of prison. So with an amazing passion that was born out of blind tenaciousness, and I believed I could have a future with this man. And of course, he painted a beautiful picture in all of his letters. So he would write exhaustive letters to me. I mean, they were pages and pages long, 11, 12, 13 pages long. And he built this fantastic future in my mind and my heart that we would have together, and I believed him. Faith is a really strong thing, as we can see. And my faith in him was very strong. I so believed him. My father had cancer at the time, and they'd only given him 3 months to live, and he actually lived 9 months. But I'll call him TK. I told TK that I would not leave as long as my father was alive, and vowed to spend as much time with my father as I could. I remember driving 150 miles every weekend and then return in time to go to work on Monday just to spend some time with my dad. Then there came a weekend when I could tell that my dad was near death. He was already in hospice, and he appeared to be semi-comatose. And if you've been following me, you saw my video about my dad. But I didn't know if he was really aware of his surroundings, and he was extremely weak by this time. So I called into work one day. It was a Monday morning when I was supposed to be at work. And I asked for one more day because I could see my dad was so close to the end. And they told me I had to be at work immediately, that I'd taken enough time off. I really hadn't taken any time off. It was my weekend. So I drove the 75 miles back to work, and no sooner had I entered the door of the office when my boss says to me, "Debbie, your mother just called. You need to go back. Your father passed away." So I did. I turned around and I drove back, and believe me, I was so angry that they couldn't just give me a few more hours to be with my dad at the end. Well, after my dad passed away, there was nothing to keep me from moving out to where my man was. And the whole family seemed to disperse in many different directions. So I felt that was the time for me to go. And so here I was. I packed up lock, stock, and barrel, and I moved out to Oklahoma. And it was an amazing experience. Regardless of the outcome, it was an amazing experience. I need to say that when you're in a relationship with someone who's doing time, you're doing time. Men in prison, and women for that matter as well, they have to make that time beneficial. If they're ever going to get out of prison, they have to start laying the groundwork for a future. And so the person doing time with the inmate has to make their time positive, constructive, and beneficial as well. So while he was doing everything on his end to get out of prison, I was doing everything on my end to get him out of prison. And so I basically had to sell him. I would meet with governors and senators and House representatives and ministers, and I appealed to all my friends to write on his behalf. However well-intended they were, and they said they would write, they didn't have the time, and they weren't going to take the time. I was working a full-time job and going to school, so in the evenings I would write letters for everyone else. I interviewed them and I asked them, if you were going to write the letters, what would you say? And then I took that information and I made each letter personal. I wrote about 350 letters a month, not including the letters that represented me. And I would put all those letters into large manila folders with stamped envelopes for each letter. And I would send it off, and all they had to do was sign it and stick it in the mailbox. I made it easy for them. I would be up till 2, 3, or 4 in the morning writing those letters, and then show up at work at 8. So not only is a relationship with an inmate extremely time-consuming, but it's expensive. The phone calls alone for 15 minutes once a week came to $175. Your time is managed in a way that all your priorities are about your prisoner. And you're at that phone anticipating that call, because they will call on a regular basis at a given time, and you're at that phone. This was before cell phones, so it wasn't like they could call me anytime, anywhere. That meant I had to be in my home, at my phone, when that phone call came on a Friday, and then drive to my father's house. It's a crazy life, but you live for that dream that one day you will be with that person, and the life that you have imagined will come to fruition. You know, my heart goes out to people who have relationships with inmates, because they make so many sacrifices. It's hard to imagine some of the sacrifices that they make. And the average person wouldn't even consider making some of these sacrifices. For example, when I would go to visit, there would be women who flew from other countries to be with their men. And we would stay at a place called the Hospitality House, and it was a fellowship for women who were anticipating their glorious futures with their men, I met people from England and all kinds of places that would come to be with their inmates just for a very short time. For myself, I would drive on Sundays 2.5 hours to go and visit for 1 hour. And we were between glass. It wasn't like we could touch. It wasn't like, you know, it wasn't a real social event. It was a time of business, because then I would get instructions of what I needed to do to assist him in his case. So, but I'm driving 2.5 hours to get to the prison, and then there's no guarantee that I'll see him, because when you're going to a prison, any kind of circumstance could interrupt your plans. There could be a lockdown, or there could be any kind of a situation that prevents you from having that visit. And so what do? You turn around and you drive the 2 hours back home, and nothing happens. You don't get to see him. You don't get to talk to him. You can't leave a message. Then there's the issue of access and the availability of phones. For the first 3 years of my relationship with this man, we were never in the same room. We were always separated by glass, talking on phones. And in the phone area, there was 12 phones, but there was only 3 of them that worked. So that meant that if I was going to get to talk to my man, that I was going to have to be at that prison at least 3 hours earlier. Because what I would do was I would sit at the top of the stairs next to the check-in area and wait for the check-in time so that I would be first in line and I would be guaranteed a phone. And you're sitting up at the top of these stairs. You can't bring anything in with you. Can't bring a magazine, can't bring a notebook, can't bring a pen. You can't bring anything in. And so you're sitting at the top of these stairs, and it's not a waiting area. It's where you would check in. And you're sitting there for 3 hours with nothing to do. And all you can do is pray and fantasize. And the staff would be walking by you, and they're looking at you like you're trash, like you're worthless, like you're an idiot. And you know what? In some cases, they're right. But you just sit there, and it was agonizing, it was humiliating. But you sit anyways, because you're driven by love and a purpose and a plan. And you hope that plan will happen. Anyways, after multiple unsuccessful parole bids, he was finally approved for parole, and it would be another year before he would actually be released from prison. In that year, there's a process of reintegration, and you go from maximum security to medium security to minimum security to community corrections. And hopefully during that time, you're assimilating into what's going to be society at large, you know. So the dynamics changed at this point, and he and I were able to actually be in the same room and talk to each other, but we could respectfully touch, like we could give a hug maybe when we greeted each other, but that was it. No holding hands, no anything else. And so essentially I've never had any contact with this individual, and now I do. And so the excitement is heightening, you know. I get to see him, I get to talk to him, we're together. So during the community corrections period and the reintegration process, the individual is actually forced in a way to interact with society. And they're required to leave the prison. They get into a prison bus and they are driven out into the community, and they're just dropped off to find work. And so they can put in applications and they can try to find a job. And at the end of the day, they're picked up by the prison bus again. So there was also another advantage too, I might add, that on Sundays he was allowed to go off-site and go to church. He didn't go with me. He goes again in the prison bus, and they have a a church that they all go to. But the neat thing is that after church, we were allowed to fellowship, and I would pick up food that he wanted to eat, maybe Kentucky Fried Chicken or something like that. And we'd have like a picnic at the church. It was nice. And it gave us an opportunity to talk without oversight, let's say. So I want to add, though, throughout this time, there was no real affection demonstrated. Not only was it not allowed, but today I know it wasn't in his heart to be affectionate towards me. These semi-private moments were the times I lived for. But I was so blinded by what I believed our future would be that I was in denial about the lack of affection or interest of him towards me. So anyways, going on to the rest of my story, something interesting about this man was that he was what they refer to in prison as a shot caller. And he had a lot of influence in prison, and his reputation followed him to each level of his prison experience. But there was always an element of danger. And so he would always emphasize the danger that he felt. Now, I don't know if it was real or imagined, I have to say this, but I know there was an element of danger because in the 5 years we were together, he did get what is called shanked, and he got stabbed by one of the other inmates. And there's a lot of competition and there's a lot of jealousy. But anyways, getting on. So when he finally got to community corrections, his reputation preceded him. And he was in a cell with 5 other inmates. And it's a whole different environment. He doesn't have the cell doors closed, anything like that. They're open doors, but they're large rooms, and they have beds in there for as many as 6 men. And anyways, he convinced me that in order to maintain his security and his safety, that it would be wise for me to provide some benefits to his cellmates. So I would order pizzas and Chinese food and KFC for everyone in the cell. And this supposedly offered him some protection because they were getting benefits, virtually through him. I didn't understand any of this at the time, and this whole experience was an absolute education for me. I learned a lot. At this point of his incarceration, he was able to go to his job, and he got a job at a car wash. And a little kind of comedic sidebar here is that because he'd been incarcerated for so long, he had never experienced a lot of the modern devices that were common, that we see all the time, every day. And so he's in one of these modern cars, and he's wiping off the dash, and he must have hit some kind of a locking device for the doors. So he couldn't get out. He didn't know how to unlock the doors, and the tinted windows were so dark that nobody could see him in crisis inside the car, and he's laying on the horn, and nobody can see him, and they don't know what's going on. But anyways, eventually somebody figured out that he was in crisis, and they let him out. Well, little did I know, but he began having an affair with the manager at the car wash where he worked. The day finally came when he was being discharged, and I had waited for this day for years. I was so excited, and I imagined him walking out of prison and running into my arms and having our first real kiss, and that was not going to happen. Because what happened was, he told me that he wanted his brother-in-law to pick him up. Because in 30 years, he hadn't had any quality time with his brother-in-law, who was a highway patrolman. And if I didn't mind, he wanted his brother-in-law to pick him up. And of course, I was going to go along with whatever he wanted. The last thing I wanted to do was make any waves. And so when he got picked up by his brother-in-law, I gave his brother-in-law my credit card, and I said, hey, you know what? Go out to eat, have a good time, get gas. You know, I've always been very generous, and I'm still generous. But anyways, shortly thereafter, I receive a call from TK, and he's asking me if him and his brother-in-law can get a hotel because they want to reminisce and have a chat and kind of just, go over old times, sort of, before he goes home and is dominated and all of his time is, being demanded by the family. And I said, sure. Well, I later found out that I'd paid for 2 hotel rooms, one for his brother-in-law and one for him and the woman he was having an affair with. Now, all of this stuff that I'm now fully aware of, I had no clue about any of this. And when I finally understood that I had just been used, it was devastating. Anyways, so I had rented a little house, a trailer, a nice little trailer. I fixed it up really nice and cute, and I thought that is where we were going to, where we were going to start our future together. And I so totally trusted this man. I believed everything he told me. And so he says to me that he couldn't come to live with me, that he'd had to be paroled to his father's house. And his father lived in the same trailer park, not far from me. And it sounded reasonable that he had to be paroled to a relative, so I didn't argue with him about that. And his brother-in-law and sister lived in the same trailer park as well. And we were all in walking distance of each other. But despite the fact that we were all in walking distance of each other, he insisted on using my car to go back and forth between the houses. So I want to add before I continue that in every experience there's a lesson. And I never thought of myself as a people pleaser or codependent. But as a matter of fact, I didn't even know what those terms meant, but I do now. And I was probably the epitome of a people pleaser and a codependent person. And I feel like a fool that I was so easily deceived, and that after a very short visit in the evenings, he would say to me, oh, I have a curfew. I have to get back to my dad's. And so he'd leave the house. Never in a million years would I have thought that after leaving my place, he would drive to his girlfriend's place, and round trip it was 174 miles. And he did that every night. I knew that he was going to need a vehicle. Now, mind you, I don't know that any of this stuff is going on behind the scenes. In my mind, everything's going to work out. And I knew he was going to need a vehicle because he was going to start working, in my mind. He was going to start working, and and then once he started working, we could attack that debt that I amassed while he was in prison. And I thought, and he always told me, we'll take care of it when I get out. We'll take care of it when I get out. And I believed him. So what do? I have a stretch Suburban, top of the line, and I change it over into his name, and he has the title now. The vehicle is his. A note here is that he also still had my credit cards for incidentals, for gas and stuff like that. And I came back home to California to visit with my kids for Christmas. So unbeknownst to me, while I'm here, he goes and gets an apartment. And with my credit card, he pays for the security, He gets the utilities turned on and all the deposits. He gets appliances and furniture, and he buys clothes, and, you know, he just spends like it's going out of style. Well, a funny thing about all that, though, is I found out about the apartment, of course, and I believed it was going to be for us together. How he got approval to get his own apartment at that time, I wasn't thinking that if he had to be paroled to his dad's, then suddenly how can he get an apartment? So I find out later on that he moved his girlfriend in. And not knowing, but thinking, well, you know what? He's at his apartment now. He's getting settled. It would be nice if I drove over there one morning with some coffee and donuts, and before I go to work, before he goes looking for work, that we just, you know, can have a nice morning together. Wrong. Because when I pull up, him and his girlfriend are walking out of the apartment. They get into the car, and they see me because I pull up right in front of the vehicle. They see me, but I do nothing. I just pull away, and they pull away. And that was the last time I ever saw him. But it's not the end of the story, because my grief goes way deeper than just the betrayal, the disappointment, and the aching loss of a fantasy that never was going to happen. Finally, the bills for the credit cards comes in. It's around $40,000. I'm devastated and I'm broken. Well, of course, I canceled the card. As soon as I saw them come out of the apartment, I canceled the card. And for the next 2 months, or pardon me, I contacted the credit card agency and I said, send me all of the receipts from the last 2 months. Well, when I finally get all of the receipts from the bills, I open the mailbox and there's nothing but white in front of me. I mean, hundreds of envelopes of bills. And I stick my hand in and I push them down to pull them out of the mailbox. It was stuffed. And I start looking through the bills. And I can't breathe even. I can't breathe. The bills were so exhaustive. And then the realization of how I had been duped is consuming me. One thing, though, that's kind of funny. I open one of these bills, and it's a $660 receipt to Christie's Toy Box. And I say to myself, well, thank God, at least he bought some gifts for the grandkids. I don't even know that Christie's Toy Box is an adult store. Anyways, I attempt to recoup my money by contacting an attorney, and the attorney says to me, sorry, you gave him the credit card. So in essence, you gave him permission to do whatever he wanted with it. Another disappointment. Is the story over? Not yet. I was so wounded and so angry that I literally wanted to kill him. My anger just consumed me. I went out and I bought a gun. And my new fantasy was to blow his head off. And then something happened. I had an epiphany. And I thanked God that I had not married this man. All the years I'd waited for this man had been filled with productive activities. Because of him, I was able to get an amazing education. I got a bachelor's, I got a master's, I got 2 masters. I bought a piece of property, a beautiful 7 acres with a nice home on it, and I lived in that environment. And my paradise was right there where I had established a life for myself. I was living a life better than I ever dreamed or imagined or even expected. And I know I couldn't have had that life with him because he was a criminal. He was a con man to the bone. When he was out of prison, 11 years, he went and robbed a bank. And I realized, Debbie, you dodged a bullet. There's a scripture in Genesis 50:20, Genesis 50:20, where Joseph is seeing his brothers who had thrown him into a pit and sold him into slavery. And because of a famine, they had to go to him for rations. And it's the first time they're seeing him and they're petrified. They're afraid he's going to retaliate against them for what they did to him. But what does Joseph say to them? This is the scripture that I have embraced because of the experience. He says to them, do not be afraid. What man had intended for evil, God intended for good, that many lives would be saved. My degree is in drug abuse and alcoholism, and I have had the privilege of helping many people save themselves from this disease, from addiction. It was the relationship that I developed with God and Jesus Christ and the comfort that I found in the Word of God that gave me strength to forgive this man and to thank him for moving on and leaving me with an amazing life. I realized he was never going to be reformed, and I'd have spent a lifetime going to prisons. I know that this is going to be a familiar story to some people, and I hope for those men and women who are having this experience that they will get through it and their dreams will be imagined. I've been through that, and it's important that you use discernment and learn from the experience. I realized upon reflection that this man had exhausted all of his resources. His family had given up on ever seeing him get out of prison. His mother had already passed away, and then I came along. And I brought with me a renewed enthusiasm and hope, and I asked myself, if I were in his shoes, would I have done the same thing? I don't know. Desperate people do desperate things. I couldn't hold it against him. God used me to get this man out of prison and for me to learn something about life that I could not have learned otherwise. All those years alone cured me of my need to have a man in my life. And I was content with my own company. I had accomplished amazing things. I'm grateful that I got this man out of prison, and I'm equally grateful for the lessons I've learned through the experience. I would really love to hear from anyone who is having a similar experience and would like to make a comment. But I also do want this story to serve as a warning. Don't believe everything you hear. Actions speak louder than words. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it's probably wrong. Look for those red flags. Anyways, I thank you for listening to my story of grief. It's different than the other stories of grief, but grief does come in many different forms. Sometimes losing a pet is worse than losing a parent. Losing a dream can be worse than anything, and this was my experience. And so I thank you, and God bless you, and live a good life. And for those of you who are with men or women in prison, they're doing time, you're doing time. Make your time count. Thank you.